In this gospel text which we have today, we see a familiar contest, a familiar conflict between the Pharisees and their doctrine and their understanding of God's revelation and the teaching of Jesus. The Pharisees were good people. They observed the laws, they followed the traditions of the Torah. They were judgmental and they were hard in their judgments. But in many ways they were honorable. They were people of the law. They spoke about institution and tradition. But Jesus spoke a different gospel. Jesus spoke about the language of the soul, not the language of the body. He spoke about the inner person. Now, Ronald Rolheiser, in his book, The Holy Longing, tells us a little bit about the soul. I think when we were young, we learned in the catechism the soul was like a Kleenex, it was white, and then when you sinned, it's something black, and then you went to confession, it became white again, and you were pure. That's okay, but it's a very simplistic understanding of the soul. Rolheiser goes on to treat this rather nicely. He says the soul, the language of the soul, is the language of mercy, of kindness, of generosity, the language of forgiveness and inclusion, the language that blesses and gives life, the language of healing, the language of truth, honesty, transparency. That's the language of the soul. He goes on to tell us that the soul is the principle of life, which means it's the source of energy within us and the source of integration. So that when a person dies, and we have to say the soul left the body, there is no more energy, and the body begins to fall apart. It decomposes because the principle of integration is no longer there. Therefore, it's the source of energy and the principle of integration that holds us together. And someday you may get up and look in the mirror and be caught in all sorts of conflicts or disputes, and you'll say, I'm falling apart. If you find yourself saying that, you're dealing with a damaged soul. It's something inside of you. If you're out of energy and you have no ambition, you have no place to go, you have no vision in your life, you have no meaning for living, the principle of life and energy is diminished. The sign of a damaged soul. Deceit, lies, greed, arrogance, injustice, all offend the soul. They create conflict inside of us. In our families, in our churches, where we have conflict, where you have a diminished energy, the apostolate is dying, where you have a certain emptiness in your spirit, the sign of a damaged soul. And Jesus says, I have come not to abolish the law, but to bring it to fulfillment, to speak about the inner person, the secret that we keep, the thing that weighs on us, the conflicts we find inside of us, all signs of a damaged soul. In early 13th century, St. Francis of Assisi had a vision at the little church of San Damiano, which is near Assisi. And Jesus on the cross spoke to him and he said, Francis, rebuild my church. My house is in ruins. And at first, Francis thought he meant about the physical structure, but he would go to learn. He was talking about the corruption in the church and the emptiness and the poverty and the diminished soul in the church. And so he will dedicate his life to building the soul, the language of the soul in the life of the church. And the church is in need of reform. We're in need of structural reform. But much more than that, we're in need of the reform of the soul, where you have deceit and abuse and arrogance. It's a sign of real wound in the soul. Something very seriously has gone wrong inside. And it will not be corrected by merely structural reform. Look at ourselves in our parish or in your homes, where you have conflict, where there is selfishness, where there is severe judgment, where people are excluded, where people are wounded in our families. It comes from inside of us. It's a diminished, wounded soul. Where we find in our churches that people are excluded or judged or set aside or made to feel less than unique in the presence of God, it's a sign that the soul of the church is damaged. The source of energy is diminished. The sense of integration and serenity and belonging and genuine, authentic community is somehow damaged. What does this mean to us? It means when we look at the big church, there is need of structural reform, but there is also need of reform of the spirit of the soul, a spiritual reformation, so that the secrets or lies and all these things offend the depth of the soul in the church, in our families, in our communities, in our work, wherever it is. The soul which is alive seeks justice, honesty, decency, shares blessings. This is a soul that's alive. The wound in the soul is probably our deepest secret. Something that only happens in our homes, perhaps. And you'll find that something inside of me, which cannot be addressed from the outside, I have to renew something inside myself. It's not based on laws like the Pharisees. Illegalism is based on the growing of the Spirit, or diminishing of the Spirit inside of us. Now, we can talk about reforming the big picture, which is desperately needed, but we need to be reformed in our own lives, perhaps in our families, in our relationships, in our community at Holy Family. Not so much keeping the law, but the fulfillment of the law preached by Jesus Christ, which is the language of the soul. I had a teaching about this some years ago. I was on a sabbatical, and I was following the footsteps of St. Paul down there in Turkey and in Greece. I was traveling by myself with my backpack, and on a bus from Istanbul to Izmir. Izmir is near Ephesus. I wanted to get to Ephesus. I've got in conversation in the bus with this young couple from Sydney, Australia, Steve and Michelle. They had been traveling for 2 years in Europe. Young people from Australia do that. They just keep traveling. And they work the beer festival up in Munich and make some money, and then they keep going. And we got in conversation, and they asked me where I was going. I said, I'm going to Izmir and then to Ephesus, and then I'm going to cross the Greek Isles. I'm going to begin with the Isles of Samos. They said, that's where we're going. Do you want to travel together for a week? And I said, fine. So we traveled together for a week. I met them every morning. We spent the day together. At night, we went out. We were festive. I was singing. We had a great time. And I meet them in the morning. They were in bad shape, normally in the morning from drinking a lot, and they'd say, what have you been doing? And I'd say, I pray. I'm a priest. I pray the Mass in the morning. I was staying in a little pension. They had a tent, backpacks in a tent. And they never once asked me about God. Not a word. But I wrote them into my journal every night, and I was wondering, what is God saying to me? How am I learning from this couple? They were 21 years old. I became a father figure for them. You have to go home. You can't keep traveling like this. You need to claim your life. Say, we want to go to Egypt. Well, I'll tell you what to see in Egypt, and then go home, and I'll call you for Christmas. It's true. I was a father figure for them. So we talked and talked and talked. And I noticed that they were very transparent. They were very honest. They told me they had a big fight in Munich, and they separated for a month, and it was very painful. They talked about their pain and their struggles. And I noticed in the ferry, getting off the ferry, they were very sensitive. They'd help an elderly person carry the luggage off the ferry. And I began to see real goodness in this couple. And when I was leaving, I was going to Athens to go to Corinth, and they were going on to some other island. And on the dock, as I was getting on the ferry, I blessed them. Kind of a going away blessing. Said, I'll call you for Christmas, go home. And then when I got to Athens, I was writing a journal that night. Now, they've been living in this tent for 2 years. I presume they're not just saying the rosary in that tent for the last 2 years. But it doesn't seem to matter. I can see beyond all of that. I can see their goodness. I can see the richness. I can see God's presence in them. And writing my journal in Athens, I was saying, I wonder if they showed up at Holy Family and they said they wanted to get married. Would I first show them a book of law? And after I had lost them, wish I had loved them first? Would I first show them a book of love? And after I have loved them and welcomed them, and then I would introduce them to the disciplines of Jesus Christ, the Word of God in the Spirit. They changed the way I would greet people. Not by the letter of the law, but the Spirit taught by the itinerant rabbi from Nazareth. It's the language of the soul. That's what this gospel is about. Jesus says, what's inside of you? The selfishness, it all comes from there. Inside of you is beauty and goodness and wonder, and blessing and love. Wow. That's where the gospel comes alive. Not in structures, not in laws. This is to way beyond the law. The law is the minimum. The teaching of the Rabbi Jesus is beyond the law. It's something beautiful, wonderful, and it's something to which the Word of God today calls us. Amen.